The rope burns on her wrists were nothing compared to the sound of the approaching locomotive. Cassandra Mitchell could feel the vibrations through the steel rails beneath her back, each rhythmic thump growing stronger, more urgent. The men who had tied her here were long gone, melting back into the shadows of Millbrook's industrial district like the cowards they were. But as the headlight of the 1147 freight train cut through the darkness ahead, only one thought consumed her mind. Would Marcus find her in time? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 3 months ago, she would never have imagined this moment. 3 months ago, she was just another banker's daughter living a predictable life in the respectable part of town. That was before she met the man they called a warrior, before her heart chose love over safety, before the most powerful family in the county decided her fate. Cassandra had always been told she was meant for better things. Growing up in the white, colonial house on Elm Street, with its perfectly manicured lawn and rose garden that her mother tended with obsessive care, she learned early that appearances mattered more than truth. Her father, William Mitchell, owned the largest bank in Millbrook County, and with that ownership came expectations that weighed heavier than the gold bars locked in his vault. A Mitchell woman carries herself with dignity. Her mother, Eleanor, would remind her every morning as she adjusted Cassandra's posture at the breakfast table. "We don't associate with common folk, dear. We have a reputation to maintain." At 23, Cassandra had mastered the art of being everything her parents wanted: polite at social gatherings, knowledgeable about literature and music, skilled at managing household accounts, and most importantly, completely unattached to anyone her father hadn't personally approved. Her days followed a rhythm as predictable as clockwork: morning walks through the respectable neighborhoods, afternoon tea with the wives of other prominent businessmen, evening dinners where she listened to her father discuss bank business with visiting associates. The arrangement with Theodore Blackwood had been decided long before she was old enough to understand what it meant. Theodore was the heir to the Blackwood steel fortune, a family whose wealth had built half the factories in the county, and whose influence reached into every corner of local politics. He was handsome enough in the clean-cut way that made mothers nod approvingly, educated at expensive universities back east, and utterly, completely boring. "Theodore will make an excellent husband," her father announced one evening over dinner, as if he were discussing a favorable business investment. "The Blackwoods and the Mitchells joining forces will secure both our families' futures for generations." Cassandra had nodded politely, the way she'd been taught, but something inside her chest felt like a door slamming shut. She'd spent so many years being the perfect daughter that she'd almost forgotten she had desires of her own, dreams that existed beyond the carefully constructed world of social expectations and financial security. The weekly charity work at the Veterans Hospital was her one escape from the suffocating routine. Every Thursday afternoon, she would drive her father's Buick to the edge of town where the county had built a modest facility for soldiers returning from overseas conflicts. It wasn't glamorous work reading to men who'd lost their sight, writing letters for those whose hands shook too badly to hold a pen, simply sitting with the ones who needed someone to listen to stories they couldn't tell their families. Eleanor had initially objected to the volunteer work, calling it unseemly for a young lady of breeding, but William saw it as good public relations for the bank. "Shows we care about our community heroes," he'd said with the calculating smile he wore during business meetings. "Besides, it's temporary. Once she's married to Theodore, she have other responsibilities." Cassandra threw herself into the work with an intensity that surprised even her. For 3 hours every Thursday, she could forget about wedding preparations and social obligations. She could be useful in a way that had nothing to do with her family's money or status. The veterans treated her with a genuine respect she'd never experienced in her regular social circle, not because of who her father was, but because she showed up consistently and actually cared about their well-being. It was during her 6th month of volunteer work that she first heard about Marcus Sullivan. "You should meet Sully," said James Rodriguez, a former Marine who'd lost his left leg to shrapnel. "He's the one who carried me out when our convoy got hit. Saved my life and 3 other guys that day. They call him a warrior, and they ain't wrong." The other veterans spoke of Marcus with a reverence usually reserved for mythical figures. He wasn't just another soldier who'd served his country. He was the kind of man who'd thrown himself into danger to protect others, who'd earned medals, not through politics or connections, but through acts of genuine heroism. According to the stories, he'd returned to Millbrook after his discharge and now worked at Henderson's Auto Repair, spending his evenings helping other veterans adjust to civilian life. "He don't talk much about what happened over there," explained Robert Chun, whose burns covered most of his arms and face. "But when one of us is having a rough night, he's the first one to show up. Doesn't matter if it's 3 in the morning or if he's got work the next day. Marcus shows up." Cassandra found herself thinking about this mysterious warrior throughout the following weeks. In her sheltered world, she'd never encountered anyone who'd faced real danger for something larger than themselves. The men in her social circle were concerned with profit margins and stock portfolios, with maintaining their comfortable positions rather than risking anything for others. The opportunity to meet Marcus came sooner than she'd expected. During her volunteer shift on a particularly cold Thursday in February, she was reading to Harold Peterson, a veteran who'd been blinded by an explosion, when raised voices echoed from the corridor outside his room. "I don't care what the regulations say," came a voice she didn't recognize, deep, steady, but with an edge of controlled anger. "Danny hasn't eaten in 3 days because he's too proud to ask for help, and his benefits are tied up in bureaucratic nonsense. Someone needs to do something now." Through the partially open door, Cassandra could see a tall figure in work clothes confronting Dr. Harrison, the hospital administrator. The man's dark hair was slightly mussed, and grease stained his hands and the sleeves of his flannel shirt. Even from behind, there was something about his posture straight-backed but not rigid, ready without being aggressive, that spoke of inner strength. "Mr. Sullivan, I understand your concern," Dr. Harrison was saying in his practiced bureaucratic tone. "But there are proper channels for these requests. We can't simply proper channels?" The man turned slightly, and Cassandra caught her first glimpse of Marcus Sullivan's profile. His face was weathered but not old, marked by experience rather than age, with the kind of strong jawline that belonged in classical paintings of noble warriors. "Danny's been waiting on your proper channels for 6 weeks while he's been rationing his medication and choosing between rent and food." "How is that proper?" Harold had stopped listening to the story Cassandra was reading, his head turned toward the door. "That's our Marcus," he said with obvious pride. "He's probably found another veteran who's slipping through the cracks. He can't stand seeing his brothers struggle." The conversation in the hallway was escalating, and Cassandra found herself setting down the book and moving closer to the door. She'd never heard anyone speak to Dr. Harrison with such directness in her world. Conflicts were handled through careful politeness and behind-the-scenes maneuvering. "I'll personally guarantee Danny's expenses," Marcus was saying. "Food, medication, whatever he needs until his benefits come through. Just get him the help he's earned." "Mr. Sullivan, that's very generous, but it's not generous. It's what you do for your family." There was finality in Marcus's voice that made it clear the conversation was over. "I'll bring Danny by tomorrow morning. Please have someone available who can actually help him instead of shuffling papers." Cassandra watched through the crack in the door as Marcus walked away, his work boots echoing against the linoleum floor. There was something in his movement purposeful but not hurried, confident without arrogance, that made her pulse quicken in a way she'd never experienced. "He's something else, isn't he?" Harold said from behind her. "Most people see a problem and complain about it. Marcus sees a problem and fixes it." That night, lying in her comfortable bed in her parents' perfect house, Cassandra couldn't stop thinking about the man in the corridor. She'd been raised to believe that true strength came from wealth and social position, that real power meant having others do things for you. But Marcus Sullivan seemed to operate by completely different rules that said strength meant taking care of others, that power meant using whatever you had to help those who needed it most. She began timing her volunteer shifts differently, hoping to catch another glimpse of the mysterious warrior the veterans spoke of with such respect. It took 3 weeks, but her patience was rewarded on a Thursday afternoon when she was helping organize donated clothing in the hospital storage room. She heard his voice. Before she saw him, that same steady tone she remembered from the corridor. Confrontation, but gentler now, speaking to someone with obvious care. "Easy there, Tommy. Nobody's judging you for needing help. We all need help sometimes." Cassandra peered around the storage room door to see Marcus kneeling beside a young man who couldn't have been more than 20, his uniform suggesting he was recently discharged. The young veteran was shaking, his eyes darting around the room as if looking for threats that existed only in his memory. "I can't sleep," Tommy was saying, his voice barely above a whisper. "Every time I close my eyes, I'm back there. I hear the explosions, smell the smoke. I don't know how to make it stop." Marcus's response was immediate and instinctive. He placed a steady hand on Tommy's shoulder, grounding him in the present moment. "It stops when it stops, brother. Not when you force it to, not when other people think it should, but when your mind is ready to let go of keeping you safe from something that's already over." "How do you know?" Tommy asked, and Cassandra could hear the desperate hope in his voice. "Because I've been where you are. Because every one of us in this room has fought battles that followed us home. The difference is, you don't have to fight this one alone." Cassandra watched, transfixed, as Marcus spent the next hour simply being present with Tommy. He didn't offer empty platitudes or quick fixes. He didn't try to minimize the young man's pain or rush him toward healing. He just sat there, solid and unshakable, proof that it was possible to carry terrible experiences and still be whole. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. When Tommy finally left, looking steadier than he had when he'd arrived, Marcus remained in the common room, checking on other veterans, listening to their stories, offering practical help where he could. Cassandra observed him with growing fascination, seeing how naturally the other men turned to him for guidance, how his mere presence seemed to create a sense of safety in the room. She was so absorbed in watching Marcus that she didn't notice Harold Peterson approaching with his white cane until he spoke directly beside her. "You know, Cassie," Harold said with knowing amusement in his voice, "staring at a man from behind a door isn't the best way to get acquainted." Cassandra felt heat flood her cheeks. "I wasn't staring. I was just watching our warrior." With the kind of interest that's got nothing to do with charity work, Harold finished with a chuckle. "Don't worry, honey. Half the nurses do the same thing. Marcus Sullivan has that effect on people. He seems very dedicated to helping other veterans," Cassandra said, trying to sound casual and professional. "Dedicated doesn't begin to cover it," Harold replied. "That man would give his last dollar to help someone he'd never met, work double shifts to cover another guy's rent, drive across 3 countries in the middle of the night if one of his brothers needed him. He's the real deal, the kind of person who makes you believe there's still good in the world." That evening, Cassandra found herself unable to concentrate on the book she was supposed to be reading before bed. Her thoughts kept returning to the scene in the hospital common room, to the way Marcus had handled Tommy's crisis with such natural compassion. She'd grown up surrounded by men who measured their worth in dollars and social connections, but here was someone whose value came from something entirely different, from his willingness to stand between others and their pain. She began volunteering extra hours at the hospital, telling her parents she was taking on additional responsibilities for the charity board. It wasn't entirely untrue, but her real motivation was the hope of encountering Marcus again. She learned his schedule from casual conversations with the other veterans. He visited every Tuesday and Friday evening, helped with a support group on Wednesday nights, and could usually be found there on weekend afternoons when he wasn't working at the auto shop. Their first real conversation happened on a rainy Friday evening in March. Cassandra was staying late to help prepare meal packages for veterans who had difficulty getting to the hospital regularly. She was alone in the kitchen, weighing portions of canned goods and checking items off a supply list, when she heard footsteps in the corridor outside. "Hello? Is someone still here?" came Marcus's voice. "In the kitchen," she called back, her heart suddenly beating faster. Marcus appeared in the doorway, and for the first time, Cassandra got a full view of the man the veterans called a warrior. He was taller than she'd realized, probably 6'2", with broad shoulders that filled out his work shirt and strong hands that showed evidence of honest labor. But it was his eyes that caught her attention, deep brown, serious, but with a warmth that suggested kindness was his default setting rather than an effort. "I'm sorry," he said, running a hand through his dark hair. "I didn't realize anyone was still working. I just came by to drop off some supplies for the weekend support group." "No problem at all," Cassandra replied, suddenly aware that she was wearing one of her simpler dresses and had flour in her hair from preparing the meal packages. "I'm Cassandra Mitchell. I volunteer here on Thursdays, but I'm helping with the meal program tonight." "Marcus Sullivan," he said, extending his hand. His grip was firm and warm, calloused from real work. "I've seen you around but never had the chance to introduce myself. The guys speak very highly of your work here." "They speak very highly of yours too," she said, then immediately worried she'd revealed too much about her interest in his activities. But Marcus just smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his serious features and made her understand why the veterans trusted him so completely. "They're good men who've been through hell. It's an honor to help them however I can." They worked together for the next hour, Marcus helping her finish the meal packages while they talked about the challenges facing returning veterans. Cassandra was struck by his thoughtfulness, the way he considered each problem from multiple angles before suggesting solutions. Unlike the men in her social circle, who often spoke just to hear their own voices, Marcus seemed to choose his words carefully, saying only what needed to be said. "The hardest part," he explained as they loaded packages into boxes, "isn't the physical injuries. Those heal, or you learn to adapt. It's the disconnect between who you were over there and who you're supposed to be back here. People want you to switch it off, go back to normal, but there is no normal anymore. You're different, and that's not necessarily bad, but it's permanent. Is that how it was for you?" Cassandra asked, then immediately worried she was being too personal. Marcus was quiet for a moment, considering her question. "I was lucky," he said finally. "I had work waiting for me at Henderson's shop, and I found purpose in helping other guys transition. But yeah, it's been an adjustment. The person who came back isn't the same one who left." "How do you mean?" "Before I deployed, I thought strength meant not needing anyone, being able to handle everything yourself. Combat teaches you different. Real strength is about connection, having someone's back, knowing they have yours. It's about being part of something bigger than yourself." He paused, studying her face. "I imagine that sounds foreign to someone from your world." Cassandra felt a flutter of defensiveness, but also curiosity. "What do you know about my world?" "Enough to know that William Mitchell's daughter probably hasn't spent much time around people who solve problems with anything other than money or influence," Marcus said, but his tone was observation rather than judgment. Not criticism, just different experiences. "You'd be surprised," Cassandra said quietly. "Money and influence don't solve the problems that actually matter." Something shifted in Marcus's expression, a recognition that perhaps she understood more than her background suggested. "No, they don't," he agreed. The things that matter most can't be bought. They finished packing the meals and comfortable. Silence, but Cassandra was acutely aware of Marcus's presence beside her. There was something about him that made her feel more awake, more present than she'd felt in years. When they were done, he helped her carry the boxes to her car, and she found herself reluctant to end the evening. "Thank you for the help," she said as they loaded the last box into her trunk. "Thank you for doing this work," Marcus replied. "The meal program makes a real difference for guys who are struggling to get back on their feet." As she drove home, through the quiet streets of Millbrook, Cassandra couldn't shake the feeling that something significant had happened. Not just meeting Marcus, though that was certainly significant, but recognizing something in herself that she'd forgotten existed. For one evening, she'd been useful in a way that had nothing to do with her family name or social connections. She'd been valued for her actions rather than her background. The contrast became painfully clear the next morning, when she joined her parents for breakfast and found Theodore Blackwood waiting in the dining room, a bouquet of expensive roses in his hand and a satisfied smile on his perfectly groomed face. "Darling," her mother said with obvious pleasure, "Theodore has wonderful news to share." Theodore stood as she entered the room, his movements precise and practiced. Everything about him was perfectly coordinated, his navy suit pressed to perfection, his hair styled exactly right, his smile calculated to be charming without being too familiar. He was handsome in the way that important men were supposed to be handsome. But looking at him now, after spending an evening with Marcus, Cassandra felt like she was seeing a carefully constructed performance rather than a real person. "Cassandra," Theodore said, taking her hand and placing a formal kiss on her knuckles, "I've just been telling your parents about our timeline. I think a fall wedding would be ideal, October perhaps, when the weather is still pleasant, but not too warm." Cassandra felt the walls of her perfectly appointed world closing in around her. "Our timeline?" she managed to say. "For the wedding, of course," Theodore continued, seeming oblivious to her lack of enthusiasm. "I've been promoted to senior vice president at Blackwood Industries, which means we can afford the kind of celebration that benefits both our families. I was thinking of the country club naturally, with a reception for 300 guests." "How romantic," Eleanor sighed, clasping her hands together. "October is such a lovely month for weddings." William nodded approvingly from behind his newspaper. "Good timing from a business perspective, too. The merger talks with Pittsburgh Steel should be concluded by then, and having the families officially united will strengthen our position in the negotiations." The merger talks, the business perspective, the calculated timing. Cassandra listened to them discuss her future as if she were a valuable asset being transferred between portfolios rather than a person with her own desires and dreams. None of them asked what she wanted, when she might be ready, or how she felt about spending her life with a man she barely knew and certainly didn't love. "I should get to the bank," William announced, folding his paper and standing up. "Theodore, walk with me to the car. I want to discuss the prenuptial arrangements." As the two men headed toward the door, discussing her marriage in terms of legal documents and financial protections, Cassandra felt something inside her rebel. This was her life they were planning, her future they were deciding, her happiness they were sacrificing for their business interests. "I need some air," she announced, standing abruptly from the table. "Don't be long, dear," Eleanor called after her. "We have an appointment with the florist at 11 to discuss arrangements." Cassandra walked quickly toward the door, desperate to escape the suffocating atmosphere of plans being made without her input. As she passed through the foyer, she could hear Theodore and her father through the open window, their voices carrying across the morning air. "The Mitchell Bank's connections in the agricultural sector will complement our industrial holdings perfectly," Theodore was saying. "Once we're married, we'll effectively control the economic infrastructure of 3 counties." "Exactly what I was thinking," William replied. Cassandra's a sensible girl. She understands the importance of family duty, as if her entire existence was meant to serve the expansion of their business empire. As if her thoughts and feelings and desires were irrelevant compared to the economic advantages her marriage would provide. Standing in her family's perfectly manicured garden, surrounded by the symbols of wealth and respectability that had defined her entire life, Cassandra felt like a prisoner in a beautiful cage. She'd been raised to be grateful for her privileged position, to understand that her comfort and security came with obligations. But after meeting Marcus, after seeing what it looked like when someone lived according to their own values, rather than other people's expectations, the cage felt smaller and more confining than ever before. She thought about the way Marcus had knelt beside Tommy, offering comfort without expecting anything in return. She thought about his calloused hands and honest work, about the respect he'd earned through his actions rather than his inheritance. She thought about the way he'd spoken of strength and connection, of being part of something bigger than yourself. For the first time in her 23 years, Cassandra Mitchell began to wonder what her life might look like if she chose it for herself. The florist appointment was a disaster. Eleanor had spent 2 hours discussing centerpieces and bouquet arrangements, while Cassandra sat in stunned silence, watching her mother plan a wedding that felt more like a business transaction than a celebration of love. When Mrs. Henderson, the florist, asked about her preferences for the bridal bouquet, Cassandra had stared blankly for so long that Eleanor had to answer for her. "White roses and baby's breath, naturally," her mother had said with forced cheerfulness. "Classic and elegant, just like our Cassandra." But Cassandra felt anything but classic or elegant. She felt like a fraud, sitting there in her proper dress and pearls, nodding at appropriate moments, while every fiber of her being screamed that this was wrong. The image of Marcus kneeling beside Tommy kept intruding on conversations about table linens and wedding favors, creating a stark contrast between the authentic care she'd witnessed and the elaborate performance being planned around her. That evening, she made a decision that would have scandalized everyone in her social circle. Instead of attending the dinner party at the Blackwoods, a state-in event designed to introduce her to Theodore's extended family, she told her parents she had a headache and needed to rest. Then, after they left for the evening, she changed into her simplest dress and drove to Henderson's Auto Repair. The shop was located in the industrial section of town, a part of Millbrook that Cassandra had never explored despite living there her entire life. The building was functional rather than beautiful corrugated metal siding, large bay doors, and the kind of honest architecture that prioritized utility over appearance. Yellow lights spilled from the windows, and she could hear the sound of tools and voices from inside. For 10 minutes, she sat in her car across the street, questioning her sanity. What was she doing here? What possible reason could she give for showing up at Marcus's workplace? But every time she considered turning around and going home, she thought about the suffocating conversation at breakfast, about Theodore's calculated timeline for their life together, about her father discussing prenuptial agreements as if she were a business asset. Finally, gathering courage she didn't know she possessed, Cassandra crossed the street and approached the open bay door. Inside, she could see Marcus working beneath the raised hood of a truck, his attention completely focused on the engine. His work shirt was rolled up to his elbows, revealing strong forearms, and there was a streak of grease across his cheek. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice barely audible over the sound of an air compressor. Marcus looked up, and the surprise on his face was quickly replaced by concern. "Cassandra, is everything all right? I'm sorry to bother you at work," she said, suddenly aware of how out of place she must look in her designer dress among the motor oil and machinery. "I was wondering if we could talk." Marcus set down his wrench and wiped his hands on a shop rag. "Of course. Let me just tell Joe I'm taking a break." He disappeared into the office for a moment, then returned and gestured toward a small break area behind the building. We can sit out back where it's quieter." The break area consisted of a picnic table and 2 folding chairs beside a small garden that someone had planted with vegetables and herbs. It was simple and unpretentious, the kind of space created for function rather than impression. But somehow it felt more welcoming than any of the elaborate rooms in her parents' house. "This is nice," Cassandra said, settling into one of the chairs. "Joe's wife planted the garden," Marcus explained, sitting across from her. "She says working on engines all day makes a man appreciate growing things." He studied her face with genuine concern. "What's on your mind? You look like you've had a rough day." The simple question, asked with such sincere interest, nearly undid her completely. When was the last time someone had asked how she was feeling and actually wanted to hear the answer? When had anyone in her life cared about her emotional state rather than her compliance with their plans? "They're planning my wedding," she said quietly, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "My parents and my fiancé. They've chosen October, decided on the venue, discussed the guest list, arranged the flowers. The only thing they haven't asked is whether I want to get married at all." Marcus was quiet for a moment, processing what she'd told him. "And do you want to get married?" "Not to him," Cassandra said, the admission feeling both terrifying and liberating. "Theodore is everything my parents think I should want: wealthy, well-connected, respectable. But being with him feels like wearing clothes that don't fit. I can go through the motions, but I never feel like myself." "What does feeling like yourself look like?" Marcus asked. The question caught her off guard. She'd spent so many years being what other people expected that she'd almost forgotten she had preferences of her own. "I don't know," she admitted. "I know it's not sitting in parlors discussing servants and social events. It's not pretending to be interested in men who see me as a trophy rather than a person. It's not having my future decided by people who never asked what I wanted. What do you want?" Another simple question that struck at the heart of everything she'd been avoiding. Cassandra looked around the humble garden, at the tomato plants and herbs growing in neat rows, at Marcus sitting across from her with motor oil under his fingernails and genuine interest in his eyes. "I want to matter," she said finally. "Not because of my father's money or my family's reputation, but because of who I am and what I do. I want to be useful in a way that makes a real difference. I want to be with someone who sees me as a partner, rather than an acquisition." Marcus nodded slowly, understanding crossing his features. "That's not unreasonable to want." "It is in my world," Cassandra said with a bitter laugh. "In my world, women like me are supposed to be grateful for security and status. We're supposed to understand that love is a luxury we can't afford." "Maybe you're in the wrong world," Marcus suggested gently. The possibility hung between them like a bridge she was afraid to cross. Could she really walk away from everything she'd known, everyone she'd been raised to please? Could she disappoint her parents, break her engagement, abandon the life that had been planned for her since childhood? "I don't know how," she whispered. "One decision at a time," Marcus said. "Start with what you know you don't want and work from there." They talked until the stars came out, sitting in that simple garden behind the auto shop, while Marcus shared stories from his deployment and his work with veterans, and Cassandra told him about her volunteer work and her growing sense that she was living someone else's life. The conversation flowed naturally, moving from topic to topic without the careful navigation required in her usual social interactions. "I should go," Cassandra said eventually, noticing how late it had gotten. "My parents will be back from their dinner party soon." "Will you be all right?" Marcus asked, walking her to her car. "I think so," she said, though she wasn't entirely sure what all right meant anymore. "Thank you for listening. I can't remember the last time someone asked what I wanted instead of telling me what I should want. Everyone deserves to be heard," Marcus said simply, driving home through the quiet streets. Cassandra felt something she hadn't experienced in years: hope. Not the artificial optimism her mother promoted or the calculated confidence her father displayed, but genuine hope that maybe, just maybe, there was another way to live. That hope sustained her through the increasingly frequent wedding planning sessions, the endless discussions of guest lists and menu options, the steady stream of congratulatory visitors who praised her good fortune in securing such an advantageous match. She began meeting Marcus regularly, always finding reasonable excuses for her absences: extended volunteer shifts at the hospital, additional charity meetings, shopping trips that somehow took hours longer than expected. Their relationship developed, slowly, built on conversations rather than grand gestures. Marcus never pressed her for more than she was ready to give, never demanded declarations or promises. Instead, he listened when she needed to talk, offered perspective when she asked for it, and gradually helped her discover parts of herself that had been buried under years of other people's expectations. He introduced her to his world carefully, taking her to places where a banker's daughter wouldn't normally be seen. They met at the diner on the edge of town where truckers and factory workers grabbed coffee between shifts. They walked through the neighborhoods where veterans lived in modest apartments and small houses, where people knew each other's names and looked out for their neighbors. They sat in the hospital break room during visiting hours, talking with men who'd served their country and now struggled to find their place in a civilian world that often seemed indifferent to their sacrifice. "You're different here," Marcus observed one evening as they sat with a group of veterans who were planning a support meeting for newer arrivals. "Different how?" Cassandra asked. "More yourself. Less careful about saying the right thing or making the right impression. Just real." He was right, and she knew it. Around Marcus and his friends, she didn't have to perform or pretend. She could ask genuine questions, express real opinions, even admit when she didn't understand something. The veterans treated her with a respect that was based on her actions rather than her background, and for the first time in her life, she felt valued for who she was rather than what she represented. The transformation didn't go unnoticed at home. Eleanor began commenting on her daughter's frequent absences and her distracted behavior during family meals. Theodore, during his regular visits, expressed concern about her philanthropic activities taking up so much of her time. "Once we're married, you'll have social obligations that will require your full attention," he reminded her during one particularly tense dinner conversation. "The wife of a Blackwood Industries executive has certain responsibilities." Cassandra felt the familiar sensation of walls closing in, but now she had a reference point for what freedom felt like. "What if I don't want those responsibilities?" she asked quietly. The question fell into the dining room like a stone into still water, creating ripples of shocked silence. Theodore's fork paused halfway to his mouth. Eleanor's hand flew to her chest, and William's newspaper rustled as he lowered it to stare at his daughter. "Don't want them?" Theodore repeated, as if she'd spoken in a foreign language. "Cassandra, these aren't optional activities. They're part of being married to someone in my position. But what if I want to continue my volunteer work? What if I want to do something meaningful with my time?" "Meaningful?" Eleanor interjected with barely concealed horror. "Dear, hosting charity luncheons and organizing social events for worthy causes is meaningful work. It's how women of our class contribute to society. I'm talking about actually helping people, not just raising money for other people to help them." William folded his newspaper with sharp, decisive movements. "Cassandra, I think you've been spending too much time with those hospital people. It's giving you unrealistic ideas about your place in the world." "My place in the world?" The phrase ignited something in Cassandra that had been smoldering for weeks. "You mean my place as an ornament in Theodore's house? My place as a symbol of successful business negotiations between your families?" "That's enough," William said firmly. "You're overwrought. Perhaps you should take a break from your volunteer work until after the wedding. And if I don't want there to be a wedding?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, transforming the elegant dining room into a battleground. Theodore set down his silverware with careful precision, his practiced composure showing the first cracks Cassandra had ever seen. "I beg your pardon?" he said, his voice dangerously quiet. Cassandra looked around the table at the three people who had controlled her life for 23 years, and suddenly she felt exhausted by the performance she'd been maintaining. "I said, what if I don't want there to be a wedding? What if I don't want to marry you, Theodore? What if I want to choose my own life?" Eleanor made a sound like a small, wounded animal. William's face turned an alarming shade of red. Theodore's carefully maintained mask of charm slipped completely, revealing something cold and calculating underneath. "I think," Theodore said slowly, "that you need some time to reconsider what you're saying. Perhaps you don't fully understand the consequences of backing out of our arrangement." "Arrangement?" Cassandra laughed, but there was no humor in it. "That's exactly the problem. My entire life has been an arrangement made by other people for their benefit." "For your benefit," William corrected sharply. "Everything we've done has been to secure your future, to ensure you'll be taken care of." "I don't want to be taken care of. I want to take care of myself. I want to be useful, to make choices, to be with someone who actually loves me rather than what I represent." The admission slipped out before she could stop it, and she saw recognition dawn in 3 pairs of eyes. Eleanor gasped audibly. William's face went from red to purple. Theodore's expression turned calculating and dangerous. "Someone?" Theodore said softly, "Are you telling me there's someone else?" Cassandra realized she'd crossed a line from which there might be no return, but the relief of finally speaking her truth was stronger than her fear. "Yes," she said simply, "there is." What followed was an explosion of accusations, threats, and ultimatums that shattered the carefully maintained facade of civilized discourse. William threatened to disinherit her. Eleanor collapsed into hysterical tears, and Theodore made it clear that he considered their engagement a binding contract that she couldn't simply walk away from. "You will not embarrass my family this way," Theodore said, his voice carrying an edge of menace that Cassandra had never heard before. "If you think you can make a fool of me publicly, you're very much mistaken." "I'm not trying to embarrass anyone," Cassandra protested. "I'm just trying to be honest about what I want." "What you want," Theodore repeated, standing from the table with deliberate slowness, "is irrelevant. What matters is what's been agreed upon between our families. Contracts have been signed, announcements have been made, business arrangements have been finalized based on our marriage. You don't get to change your mind now." The threat in his words was unmistakable, and for the first time, Cassandra began to understand that she wasn't just dealing with disappointment or wounded pride. There were larger forces at play, business interests and social expectations that treated her as a commodity rather than a person. That night, after Theodore left with promises to discuss this situation further, and her parents retreated to their room in shock, Cassandra sat in her childhood bedroom, surrounded by the symbols of her privileged life, and realized that everything had changed. She declared her independence, but she hadn't considered what the fight for it might cost. She thought about Marcus, about the way he'd described real strength as being part of something bigger than yourself, having someone's back and knowing they had yours. For the first time in her life, she understood what it meant to need someone, not for financial security or social status, but for the courage to become who she was meant to be. The next morning brought a new reality. Eleanor couldn't look at her without tears. William spoke to her only in clipped, businesslike sentences, and Theodore arrived with what he called a reasonable compromise. "I've discussed the situation with your father," he announced, settling into the parlor as if nothing had happened. "We've agreed that your recent behavior is the result of pre-wedding nerves and too much exposure to inappropriate influences." "Inappropriate influences?" Cassandra asked. "Your volunteer work at the hospital," William explained. "Spending time with soldiers and working-class people has given you unrealistic ideas about your options. We've decided you should discontinue those activities immediately. And, Theodore continued smoothly, we'll be moving the wedding date up to next month. A smaller ceremony, more intimate. It will help you focus on your proper priorities. Cassandra felt the trap closing around her, but she also felt something else, a clarity that came from finally understanding what she was fighting for and against. No, she said quietly. I beg your pardon? Theodore's voice carried the same dangerous edge from the night before. No, Cassandra repeated more firmly. I won't stop my volunteer work. I won't marry you next month. And I won't pretend to be someone and not to make your business arrangements more convenient. The silence that followed was broken by William's sharp intake of breath. Cassandra, you need to understand something. Theodore's family has significant influence in this county. Cross them, and you'll find that doors that were once open to you will slam shut. Your volunteer work, your social activities, even your safety could be affected. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Cassandra looked at her father, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time, not as the protective parent she'd always believed him to be, but as a businessman who would sacrifice his own daughter's happiness to maintain his position. Are you threatening me? She asked. I'm explaining reality, William replied coldly. You have a choice to make, and you need to understand all the consequences before you make it. That afternoon, Cassandra drove to Henderson's auto repair with her hands shaking and her heart pounding. She found Marcus in the same bay where she'd first approached him, but this time she didn't hesitate at the door. I need to talk to you, she said without preamble. Marcus took one look at her face and set down his tools. What happened? In the quiet of the break room garden, surrounded by the vegetables and herbs that represented the kind of simple, honest life she was beginning to understand she wanted, Cassandra told Marcus everything. She described the confrontation at dinner, the threats disguised as warnings, the trap that was closing around her with each passing hour. They're going to make it impossible for me to help at the hospital, she said, fighting back tears. They're going to isolate me from everything and everyone that makes me feel like myself until I have no choice but to give in. Marcus listened without interrupting, his expression growing more serious with each detail she shared. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications of what she'd told him. What do you want to do? He asked finally. I want to be free, Cassandra said immediately. I want to choose my own life, make my own decisions, be with someone who loves me for who I am rather than what I can do for their business interests. That someone being me? Marcus asked gently. The question hung between them, requiring a declaration. That would change everything. Cassandra looked at this man who had shown her what authentic strength looked like, who had listened to her dreams and fears without judgment, who had helped her discover parts of herself she'd never known existed. Yes, she said simply. If you'll have me. Marcus reached across the small table and took her hands in his calloused ones. Cassandra, I care about you more than I've ever cared about anyone. But I need you to understand what choosing me means. I'm not wealthy, I don't have social connections, and I can't protect you from your family's influence the way someone like Theodore could. I don't want protection from someone like Theodore, Cassandra said firmly. I want partnership with someone like you. Then we need a plan, Marcus said. And for the first time since the confrontation began, Cassandra felt like she wasn't facing the future alone. Because if what you've told me is accurate, they're not going to let you walk away quietly. The plan Marcus devised was both audacious and carefully calculated. Over the next 2 weeks, while Cassandra maintained the pretense of considering Theodore's compromise, Marcus quietly reached out to contacts he'd made during his service and through his work with veterans. What emerged was a network of people who understood loyalty, who knew the difference between right and wrong, and who were willing to help someone fight for their freedom. The key is information, Marcus explained during one of their clandestine meetings in the hospital chapel, a place where Cassandra could legitimately be found without raising suspicion. Theodore and your father think they hold all the cards because they control the money and the social connections. But power built on intimidation only works if people don't know the truth about what's really happening. Marcus had discovered that Theodore's business practices weren't as clean as his public image suggested. Through conversations with workers at various Blackwood Industries facilities, he'd learned about safety violations that had been covered up, wages that had been withheld from immigrant workers who couldn't fight back, and environmental damages that had been hidden from state regulators. None of it was enough for criminal charges, but it was more than enough to damage the Blackwood reputation if the information became public. "You're talking about blackmail," Cassandra said, though she felt a thrill at the idea of Theodore facing consequences for his actions. "I'm talking about leverage," Marcus corrected. "The same kind of leverage they're using against you, except based on actual wrongdoing rather than social pressure." But even as they planned their strategy, the situation at home was deteriorating rapidly. Eleanor had taken to her bed with what she dramatically called nervous exhaustion, emerging only to make tearful speeches about family duty and social disgrace. William had begun monitoring Cassandra's activities more closely, questioning her about every absence and demanding detailed explanations for her whereabouts. Most disturbing of all was Theodore's behavior. His visits became more frequent, and his demeanor more possessive. He spoke about their marriage as if it were an inevitable fact, dismissing her objections as temporary madness that would pass once she came to her senses. "I've been very patient with your little rebellion," he told her during a particularly tense conversation in her family's garden, his hand gripping her arm just tightly enough to be uncomfortable. "But my patience has limits, Cassandra. There are consequences for making me look foolish in front of my business associates." "I'm not trying to make you look foolish," Cassandra replied, pulling her arm free. "I'm trying to be honest about what I want." "What you want doesn't matter," Theodore said, his mask of civility slipping completely. "What matters is what's been decided. You'll marry me, you'll be the kind of wife I need, and you'll stop this nonsense about volunteer work and independence." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of William, who had been watching from the house with obvious approval. "Theodore's right, Cassandra. It's time to stop this childish behavior and accept your responsibilities." "My responsibilities? To whom?" Cassandra demanded. "To you? To him? What about my responsibilities to myself?" "You don't have responsibilities to yourself," William said coldly. "You have responsibilities to your family, to the agreements we've made, and to the position you were born into. Personal happiness is a luxury that people in our situation can't afford." That night, Cassandra lay awake staring at the ceiling of her childhood bedroom, feeling like a prisoner in her own home. The walls that had once represented security now felt like barriers, and the future that had been planned for her loomed like a prison sentence. She thought about Marcus's words about real strength being connection, about having someone's back and knowing they had yours. For the first time in her life, she understood what it meant to need rescue, not from external danger, but from the suffocating expectations of people who claimed to love her. The next morning brought news that changed everything. Marcus appeared at the hospital during her volunteer shift, his face grim and his usual calm composure shaken. "We need to talk," he said quietly, pulling her aside into an empty patient room. "Something's happened." Marcus had spent the previous evening at the Veterans Support Group when 3 men in expensive suits had arrived asking questions about him. They claimed to be conducting a background investigation for a potential employer, but their questions had nothing to do with work history or character references. Instead, they wanted to know about his relationships, his politics, his associations with subversive elements in the veteran community. "Subversive elements?" Cassandra asked. "Veterans who've been vocal about problems with the VA system, guys. Who've organized protests or written letters to newspapers about conditions at the hospital," Marcus explained. Nothing illegal or even particularly radical, but the kind of activism that makes powerful people nervous. The message was clear. Theodore and his family were digging into Marcus's background, looking for anything they could use to discredit him or worse. But more disturbing was what happened next. After the investigators left, James Rodriguez had pulled Marcus aside with troubling information. He told me that his cousin, who works maintenance at Blackwood Industries, overheard a conversation between Theodore and his father. Marcus continued. They weren't just planning to discredit me. They were discussing having me arrested on false charges if necessary to get me out of the picture. Cassandra felt cold dread settling in her stomach. Arrested for what? Anything they can manufacture. Theft, assault, destruction of property. Theodore apparently has connections in the sheriff's department who owe him favors. Marcus's jaw tightened with controlled anger. They're willing to destroy an innocent person's life to maintain control over yours. The realization hit Cassandra like a physical blow. She'd known her family and Theodore were manipulative, but she'd never imagined they would resort to outright criminal behavior. The idea that they would frame Marcus, destroy his reputation, and potentially send him to prison just to force her compliance revealed a level of ruthlessness that terrified her. We have to do something, she said. We can't let them. We're going to, Marcus interrupted gently. But we need to be smart about it. They're escalating because they're desperate, which means they're also making mistakes. We just need to be ready when they overplay their hand. Over the next few days, Marcus put his network into action. Veterans who had served with him began quietly documenting Theodore's business practices, gathering evidence of the safety violations and worker exploitation that could be used as leverage. Meanwhile, other contacts, men who had worked in law enforcement before their military service, started investigating the corrupt connections Theodore was using to manipulate the legal system. But even as they built their case, the pressure on Cassandra intensified. Eleanor emerged from her supposed illness with renewed determination to force her daughter into compliance. William threatened to cut off all financial support and disown her completely if she didn't end her association with undesirable elements. Most disturbing of all, Theodore began making appearances at places where Cassandra normally went. The hospital, the shops where she did errands, even the church where her family attended services. He's watching me, she told Marcus during one of their increasingly cautious meetings. It feels like I can't go anywhere without him showing up. He's trying to intimidate you into submission, Marcus replied. Classic control tactics: isolate the target, monitor their movements, make them feel like escape is impossible. Is it impossible? Cassandra asked quietly. Marcus took her hands, his calloused fingers warm and reassuring against her skin. No, but it's going to require courage, and it's going to require trust. Are you ready for that? The test of that courage came sooner than either of them expected. 3 days later, Cassandra was leaving the hospital after her volunteer shift. When she found Theodore waiting beside her car, his expression darker than she'd ever seen it. We need to talk, he said without preamble. I don't think we have anything left to discuss, Cassandra replied, trying to keep her voice steady despite the fear that was beginning to build in her chest. On the contrary, we have quite a lot to discuss. Theodore stepped closer, invading her personal space in a way that made her skin crawl. I know about your little meetings with the soldier, Cassandra. I know where you've been going, who you've been talking to, what you think you're planning. The words hit her like ice water. If Theodore knew about her relationship with Marcus, then their carefully planned strategy might already be compromised. I don't know what you're talking about, she said, but her voice lacked conviction. Don't insult my intelligence, Theodore snapped. Did you really think you could carry on a secret affair in a town this size without me finding out? Did you think I would just let some nobody mechanic steal what belongs to me? I don't belong to you, Cassandra said. her fear beginning to transform into anger. "I never have and I never will." Theodore's hand shot out and grabbed her wrist, his grip tight enough to leave marks. "You've belonged to me since the day our fathers shook hands on this arrangement. Everything else is just paperwork." "Let go of me," Cassandra demanded, trying to pull away. "Not until you understand something," Theodore said, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "Your soldier friend is about to have some very serious legal problems. Tomorrow morning, the sheriff is going to find stolen property in his possession, property that was taken from one of my warehouses. He'll be arrested, charged, and convicted. He'll spend the next 10 years in prison, and you'll spend them married to me." The casual cruelty of the threat took Cassandra's breath away. Theodore was calmly describing how he planned to destroy an innocent man's life, and he seemed to expect her gratitude for explaining it in advance. "You can't do that," she said, though even as the words left her mouth, she knew he could. "I can do whatever I want," Theodore replied with cold satisfaction. "I have money, influence, and connections. Your boyfriend has nothing but a military record and the respect of a bunch of broken-down soldiers. Guess which one carries more weight with the jury?" Theodore released her wrist and stepped back, smoothing his jacket as if the conversation had been about business rather than destroying lives. "The wedding is in 2 weeks. I suggest you use that time to say goodbye to your romantic fantasies and prepare yourself to be a proper wife." As Theodore walked away, leaving Cassandra standing beside her car with her wrist throbbing and her mind reeling, she realized that the situation had moved beyond negotiation or compromise. Theodore wasn't just trying to control her future, he was willing to destroy anyone who stood in his way. The man she'd grown up thinking she would marry had revealed himself to be someone capable of monstrous cruelty in service of his own desires. That night, she met Marcus at their usual place behind the auto shop, but this time their conversation took place in whispered urgency rather than comfortable intimacy. When she told him about Theodore's threat, Marcus's expression grew grimmer than she'd ever seen it. "He's not bluffing," Marcus said after she'd finished recounting the conversation. "I've heard rumors about evidence being planted before, usually when someone crossed the Blackwood family. The sheriff owes his election to their financial support." "So what do we do?" Cassandra asked, desperation creeping into her voice. "We accelerate our timeline," Marcus replied. "I'd hoped to gather more evidence before we made our move, but we can't wait for Theodore to follow through on his threat." Marcus had been working with a journalist at the county newspaper, a man named David Chun, who was Robert's brother and who had been investigating rumors about Blackwood Industries for months. The plan had been to gradually leak information about Theodore's business practices, building a case that would damage his reputation and reduce his ability to intimidate people. But with the threat of false charges looming, they needed to act. "Immediately, tomorrow night," Marcus said. "David's ready to publish everything we've gathered. It won't be enough to bring criminal charges, but it'll be enough to raise serious questions about Theodore's business ethics and his family's influence over local law enforcement." "And then what?" Cassandra asked. "Then we disappear for a while." Marcus said simply, "I have friends in other states, people I served with who would help us get established somewhere new. It's not ideal, but it's better than letting Theodore frame me for crimes I didn't commit." The idea of leaving everything she'd known, starting over in a strange place with nothing but hope and love to sustain them, should have terrified Cassandra. Instead, she felt a sense of liberation that surprised her with its intensity. "When do we leave?" she asked. "The night the story publishes," Marcus replied. "By the time Theodore realizes what's happening, we'll be long gone." But their carefully laid plans began to unravel the next evening when Cassandra returned home to find her father waiting in the front parlor with an expression of cold fury that made her blood run cold. "Sit down, Cassandra," William said without preamble. "We need to discuss your future." Something in his tone warned her that this conversation would be different from their previous confrontations. William wasn't angry in the way he'd been before. He was calm, calculating, and completely certain of his position. "I know about your plans," he said once she'd reluctantly taken a seat across from him. "I know about the journalist. I know about the evidence you think you've gathered. And I know about your intention to leave town with that soldier." Cassandra felt her carefully constructed world crumbling around her. If her father knew about their plans, then everything they'd worked for was compromised. How did I find out?" William smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Because I'm not the foolish old man you apparently think I am." "Did you really believe you could conduct a conspiracy against one of the most powerful families in the county without someone noticing?" The truth was worse than she'd imagined. William had known about her relationship with Marcus from the beginning, had been monitoring their activities through contacts at the hospital and informants in the veteran community. He'd allowed their plans to develop just far enough to identify everyone involved before moving to shut them down. "The journalist won't be publishing any stories," William continued with satisfaction. "David Chun has suddenly discovered that his mortgage is being called in by the bank, and his wife's job at the school district is under review for budget cuts. Amazing how quickly people's principles change when their livelihoods are threatened." "You can't intimidate everyone," Cassandra said, though her voice lacked conviction. "I don't need to intimidate everyone," William replied. "I just need to intimidate the right people. And I've been very successful at that. But the worst revelation was yet to come." William opened a folder that had been sitting on the table beside his chair and spread out a series of photographs. They showed Marcus at various locations around town, but they weren't surveillance photos, they were targeting photos, the kind used to identify a subject for purposes other than observation. "Your soldier friend has become a problem that needs to be solved," William said with casual brutality. "Theodore was willing to be subtle about it, but I prefer more direct methods." The photographs made Cassandra's blood run cold. They showed Marcus leaving his apartment, working at the auto shop, visiting the hospital, all taken from positions that would allow someone to plan an ambush or worse. "What are you planning to do?" she asked, though she was afraid she already knew the answer. "What needs to be done to protect our family's interests?" William replied. "Marcus Sullivan is going to have an accident. A tragic incident that will serve as a reminder to anyone else who might consider interfering with our arrangements." The casual way her father discussed murder, because that's what he was describing, despite his euphemisms, revealed a side of him that Cassandra had never imagined existed. This wasn't the protective parent she'd grown up believing him to be. This was a man who would kill to maintain his position and power. "Unless," William continued, "you agree to end this foolishness immediately. Marry Theodore next week as planned. Forget about your romantic fantasies, and your soldier friend can go back to his simple life without any unfortunate accidents." The choice he was offering wasn't really a choice at all. Submit to a lifetime of imprisonment disguised as marriage, or watch the man she loved die for the crime of caring about her. William had constructed the perfect trap, using her feelings for Marcus as the weapon to ensure her compliance. "I need time to think," Cassandra said, though she already knew what her decision would have to be. "You have until tomorrow night," William replied, gathering up the photographs with the same care he might use for important business documents. "Make the right choice, Cassandra. For everyone's sake." That night, Cassandra met Marcus one last time in the garden behind the auto shop. She told him everything about her father's knowledge of their plans, about the threats against David Chun, about the photographs and the ultimatum she'd been given. "We have to run tonight," Marcus said immediately, "before they can put their plan into action." "They'll find us," Cassandra replied with devastating certainty. "My father has resources we can't match, connections we can't avoid. And even if we escape, they'll never stop hunting us. So what are you suggesting?" Marcus asked, though she could see in his eyes that he already understood. "I'm going to marry Theodore," Cassandra said, the words tasting like poison. "It's the only way to keep you safe." Marcus took her hands, his grip fierce and desperate. "No, we'll find another way. We'll fight them together." "With what?" Cassandra asked, tears streaming down her face. "They have money, power, and the willingness to commit murder. We have love, and that's not enough to stop them." But Marcus had spent years learning not to accept defeat, and he wasn't about to start now. "There is another way," he said suddenly, an idea forming in his mind. "It's dangerous, and it requires perfect timing, but it could work." As he explained his plan, Cassandra felt hope warring with terror in her chest. What Marcus was proposing was audacious to the point of madness, requiring them to turn Theodore's own trap against him. But it was also their only chance at freedom, assuming they could survive long enough to see it through. "Are you willing to risk everything?" Marcus asked when he'd finished explaining. Cassandra looked at this man who had shown her what real strength looked like, who had helped her discover who she truly was, who was willing to put his life on the line for her freedom. "Yes," she said simply. "Let's do it." Marcus's plan was built on a foundation of calculated deception and military precision. For it to work, Cassandra would have to convince her father and Theodore that she had accepted defeat, while secretly positioning herself to become the bait in a trap that would expose their criminal conspiracy to the world. The key was David Chun, the journalist whose silence had been bought through threats to his family's livelihood. Marcus had discovered through the veteran network that David's apparent capitulation was itself a deception. He'd been secretly documenting the intimidation campaign against him, gathering evidence of witness tampering and conspiracy that could bring down the entire corrupt network. But he needed proof of an actual crime in progress, something that would force law enforcement to act regardless of the Blackwood family's influence. "They're planning to kill you anyway," Cassandra had realized during their final planning session. "My father's ultimatum is a lie. Even if I marry Theodore, they can't risk leaving you alive to potentially expose them later." "Which means they'll have to act soon," Marcus agreed. "And when they do, we'll be ready." The plan required Cassandra to return home and announce her surrender, convincing her father and Theodore that she was broken and ready to comply with their demands. Meanwhile, Marcus would position himself to be kidnapped by Theodore's men, but in a location where David Chun could witness and document the crime. The journalist would then have the evidence he needed to publish a story that would bring federal investigators to Millbrook, ending the Blackwood family's reign of intimidation permanently. It was dangerous, requiring split-second timing, and depending on the assumption that Theodore's arrogance would lead him to personally oversee Marcus's elimination. But it was also their only chance to escape the trap that had been closing around them. The performance began the next morning when Cassandra appeared at breakfast looking appropriately defeated. Her eyes were red from genuine tears, her posture suggested resignation, and her voice carried the hollow tone of someone whose spirit had been broken. "I've made my decision," she announced without preamble, addressing her father while pointedly ignoring Theodore, who had arrived early for the conversation. "I'll marry Theodore next week as you've planned." William's expression of satisfaction was immediate and obvious. "I'm glad you've come to your senses, daughter. This is for the best." "And the soldier?" Theodore asked, his voice carrying eager anticipation. Cassandra forced herself to look directly at him, channeling all her genuine hatred into what appeared to be broken acceptance. "I never want to see him again. Do whatever you think is necessary to ensure that." The words tasted like ash in her mouth, but they had the desired effect. Theodore's smile was predatory and satisfied, while William nodded approvingly at his daughter's apparent transformation. "I think a small ceremony would be appropriate," Eleanor interjected, emerging from her bedroom looking remarkably recovered from her nervous exhaustion now that the crisis had passed. "Given the circumstances, we should avoid anything too elaborate." Over the next 2 days, Cassandra threw herself into wedding preparations with the desperate energy of someone trying to convince herself that this was what she wanted. She submitted to dress fittings, approved flower arrangements, and discussed honeymoon plans with Theodore, as if she were genuinely excited about their future together. The performance was so convincing that even Eleanor began to believe her daughter had truly accepted her fate. But beneath the surface, a different kind of preparation was taking place. Marcus had positioned himself in a pattern of predictable behavior, making it easy for Theodore's men to track his movements and plan their attack. David Chun had taken a leave of absence from the newspaper, officially to deal with his family financial crisis, but actually to position himself for surveillance of the planned crime. The trap was set for Thursday evening, when Marcus would be leaving the hospital after his regular visit with the veterans. The timing was perfect, late enough for the industrial district to be largely deserted, but early enough for Theodore to personally oversee the operation without raising suspicions about his whereabouts. Cassandra spent that Thursday in a state of barely controlled terror, going through the motions of final wedding preparations while every nerve in her body screamed with anxiety about what was happening across town. By evening, she was so tense that Eleanor actually commented on her apparent nervousness. "Wedding nerves are perfectly natural, dear," her mother said with misplaced sympathy. "Every bride feels anxious before her big day." If only she knew, Cassandra thought, that the anxiety had nothing to do with wedding nerves and everything to do with the possibility that the man she loved might not survive the night. At exactly 9:47 p.m., according to the plan, Marcus left the hospital and began walking toward his truck in the parking lot. He moved at his normal pace, showing no signs of awareness that he was being watched, but every sense was alert for the ambush he knew was coming. They struck as he reached his vehicle, 3 men emerging from the shadows between the hospital and the adjacent warehouse. Marcus recognized 2 of them as Blackwood Industries security personnel, men whose job descriptions probably didn't include kidnapping, but whose loyalty to their employer apparently extended beyond legal boundaries. "Marcus Sullivan?" the leader of the group asked, though they all knew exactly who he was. "That's me," Marcus replied calmly, his military training keeping his voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system. "You need to come with us," the man continued, his hand moving to the weapon concealed beneath his jacket. "Mr. Blackwood wants to have a conversation with you." "And if I don't want to have a conversation with Mr. Blackwood?" Marcus asked, playing his part in the script they'd all rehearsed through their actions. "Then we'll have to insist," came the reply. As the other 2 men moved to flank him, what happened next unfolded exactly as Marcus had hoped. Instead of simply shooting him in the parking lot, which would have been efficient but difficult to cover up, the men forced him into a black sedan and drove him to a more isolated location where Theodore could confront him personally without witnesses. The location they chose was perfect for Marcus's purposes, the abandoned railway yard on the outskirts of town, where old freight cars sat rusting on unused tracks, and the nearest building was half a mile away. It was also, crucially, a location where David Chun could position himself with a camera and telephoto lens to document everything that happened. Theodore was waiting when they arrived, standing beside his expensive car like a general surveying a battlefield. The contrast between his perfectly tailored suit and the industrial decay around him would have been almost comical if the situation weren't so deadly serious. "Marcus Sullivan," Theodore said as the men dragged him from the sedan, "the famous warrior. You don't look so formidable now." Marcus said nothing, maintaining the appearance of a defeated man while actually assessing his surroundings and calculating his next moves. The railway yard offered multiple escape routes, but more importantly, it provided the kind of isolated setting where Theodore might be careless enough to make incriminating statements. "You know why you're here," Theodore continued, beginning to pace in front of Marcus like a prosecutor addressing a jury. "You've interfered with my property, corrupted my fiancée, and caused considerable inconvenience to my family's business interests. Cassandra isn't property, Marcus said quietly, his first words since being captured. Theodore's laugh was cold and humorless. Everything in this county is property, soldier. Land, businesses, people, it all belongs to whoever has the power to claim it, and I have considerably more power than you do. From his concealed position 200 yards away, David Chun was capturing every word through his directional microphone while his camera documented the scene. Theodore's arrogance was providing exactly the kind of evidence needed to prove conspiracy and kidnapping charges that no amount of influence could dismiss. You see, Theodore continued, warming to his subject, people like you don't understand how the world really works. You think honor and courage and all those other military virtues actually matter, but they're just pretty words that people use to justify their place in the natural order. The real world is about power, and I have it while you don't. What do you want from me? Marcus asked, though he already knew the answer. I want you to disappear, Theodore replied with casual brutality. Permanently. You're a problem that needs to be solved, and I'm going to solve it tonight. The explicit threat of murder, delivered in Theodore's own voice and captured on high-quality recording equipment, was exactly what David Chun needed to guarantee federal intervention. But the plan required one more element to ensure Theodore's complete downfall. What about Cassandra? Marcus asked. Does she know what you're really like? Theodore's expression grew darker, revealing the possessive rage that lurked beneath his civilized facade. Cassandra belongs to me. She always has from the moment our fathers arranged our marriage. Her little rebellion was amusing for a while, but now it's over. She'll be my wife, she'll bear my children, and she'll learn to be grateful for the privilege. And if she's not grateful? Marcus pressed, knowing he was provoking Theodore but needing to capture the full extent of his character on record. Then she'll learn to pretend, Theodore replied with chilling certainty. Women like Cassandra can be trained just like any other valuable possession. It's simply a matter of applying the right incentives and consequences. The casual way Theodore discussed owning and training another human being revealed him to be exactly the monster Marcus had suspected. But more importantly, it provided David Chen with recorded evidence of Theodore's true character that would make any jury understand exactly what kind of man they were dealing with. Theodore checked his expensive watch with the impatience of a businessman running behind schedule. I'm afraid I can't spend all evening chatting with you, soldier. I have a wedding to prepare for, and you have a permanent appointment to keep. He nodded to his men, who immediately moved to restrain Marcus more securely. But this was the moment Marcus had been waiting for, the transition from conversation to action that would provide the chaos he needed to implement the most dangerous part of their plan. Instead of submitting passively to whatever fate Theodore had planned, Marcus suddenly erupted into motion, using techniques he'd learned in military combat, training to break free from his captors and create the kind of dramatic confrontation that would look spectacular on camera while also providing him with an opportunity to escape. The fight that followed was brief but intense, with Marcus demonstrating exactly why the veterans called him a warrior. Despite being outnumbered 3-1, his superior training and desperate motivation allowed him to disable 2 of Theodore's men before the third managed to subdue him through sheer numbers. Enough! Theodore shouted, his composure finally cracking as he realized that his carefully orchestrated intimidation scene had turned into something far messier and more public than he'd intended. Just finish this. But finishing it proved more complicated than Theodore had anticipated. His men had expected to deal with a defeated victim, not a trained soldier who was fighting for his life and the woman he loved. The commotion had already lasted longer than planned, increasing the risk of discovery, and Theodore was growing visibly agitated. Sir, one of his remaining men said nervously, maybe we should move to a more secure location. No, Theodore snapped, his arrogance overruling. His caution, "We finish this here and now. I want him to know exactly who's destroying him before he dies." The decision to continue with their plan despite the complications was exactly the kind of mistake Marcus had hoped Theodore would make. Arrogance and anger were clouding the businessman's judgment, causing him to prioritize personal satisfaction over operational security. "You know what I think, soldier?" Theodore said, pulling a pistol from his jacket with the dramatic flair of someone who'd watched too many movies. "I think you're going to have an accident. A tragic case of a disturbed veteran who couldn't adjust to civilian life and decided to end it all on the railway tracks." The plan Theodore outlined was sickeningly plausible. Marcus would be found on the tracks, apparently having committed suicide by lying down in front of an oncoming freight train. His history of working with veterans dealing with psychological trauma would provide a ready explanation for his supposed mental breakdown, and Theodore's wealth would ensure that any investigation remained superficial. "And the best part," Theodore continued with obvious satisfaction, "is that Cassandra will blame herself for your death. She'll spend the rest of our marriage carrying the guilt of driving you to suicide, which will make her much more manageable. As a wife, the psychological cruelty of the plan was breathtaking in its calculated malice." Theodore wasn't just planning to commit murder. He was planning to use that murder as a weapon to psychologically torture Cassandra for the rest of her life. From his hidden position, David Chun was capturing every word, every gesture, every piece of evidence that would ultimately destroy Theodore's life just as thoroughly as Theodore was planning to destroy Marcus's. But the plan required Marcus to survive long enough for that evidence to matter. The freight train that Theodore planned to use for his manufactured suicide was the 1147 westbound, carrying steel products from the Millbrook foundries to markets in distant cities. It ran on schedule with mechanical precision, which made it perfect for Theodore's purposes but also provided Marcus with a crucial piece of information about timing. Theodore's men dragged Marcus to the main railway line that ran through the yard, forcing him down onto the tracks and beginning to secure him with rope they'd brought for exactly this purpose. The irony wasn't lost on Marcus that he was about to become a victim of the same kind of scenario that had been a cliché in melodramatic stories for generations. The hero tied to railway tracks while the villain gloated over his approaching doom. But unlike those fictional scenarios, this situation had been carefully orchestrated by people who understood modern investigative techniques and had planned accordingly. The ropes they used would be removed after the train passed, leaving behind what appeared to be a simple suicide. Theodore's alibi was already established. He would be at home with witnesses when the accident occurred. As they finished securing him to the rails, Marcus could feel the first faint vibrations that announced the approaching locomotive. The 1147 was still several miles away, but on a quiet night like this, a freight train's approach could be detected long before it became visible. "I do hope you appreciate the poetry of this, soldier," Theodore said, standing over Marcus with obvious satisfaction. "You spent so much time trying to save other people, and now no one can save you." But Theodore was wrong about that. Even as he spoke, his hubris was about to cost him everything he'd spent his life building. Because a quarter-mile away, hidden in the shadows of the railway yard's abandoned buildings, David Chun was already transmitting his evidence to federal authorities who had been waiting for exactly this kind of proof to move against the Blackwood family's criminal enterprises. And 6 miles away, racing through the night on a stolen motorcycle with sirens wailing behind him and his heart pounding with desperate determination, Marcus Sullivan was proving once again why the veterans called him a warrior. The real Marcus Sullivan was coming to save the woman he loved, while the man tied to the tracks was someone else entirely, a volunteer from the veteran community who'd agreed to help expose Theodore's crimes by playing the role of victim long enough for the authorities to arrive. The deception had been risky and complicated, requiring precise timing and absolute trust among everyone involved. But as the distant sound of the approaching train grew louder and the first police sirens became audible in the distance, it became clear that the trap had worked exactly as planned. Theodore Blackwood, standing over what he thought was his helpless victim, was about to discover that sometimes the prey was actually the predator, and that underestimating a warrior's capacity for strategy was a mistake that would cost him everything. The moment Theodore realized his trap had become his own, prison was captured forever in David Chun's final photograph, his face contorting. From smug satisfaction to confused horror, as federal agents emerged from the shadows of the railway yard, their weapons drawn and their voices cutting through the night air with commands for surrender. Federal Bureau of Investigation, nobody moves. But Theodore's shock at the appearance of law enforcement was nothing compared to his rage when he discovered the identity of the man tied to the tracks. Agent Michael Rodriguez, James Rodriguez's brother, and an undercover FBI operative who had been investigating corruption in rural law enforcement, smiled grimly as Theodore's men cut him loose from the railway ties. "Surprise," Agent Rodriguez said, rubbing his wrists where the ropes had chafed. "Though I have to say, your confession exceeded even our expectations for incriminating evidence." Theodore's carefully constructed world crumbled in the space of minutes. The federal investigation that had been building quietly for months suddenly had everything it needed: recorded confessions, witness testimony, documentary evidence of conspiracy, kidnapping, and attempted murder. The Blackwood family's network of corruption, built over decades, was exposed in a single night through Theodore's own arrogance. But even as handcuffs clicked around Theodore's wrists and agents read him his rights, his thoughts weren't on his own fate. They were on Cassandra and the rage that consumed him at the realization that she had played him just as thoroughly as her soldier had. "You think this changes anything?" Theodore snarled as Agent Rodriguez's colleagues led him toward their vehicles. "You think you've won? Cassandra is still going to pay for this humiliation, and there's nothing you can do to stop it." The threat sent ice through Agent Rodriguez's veins, because he knew something the others didn't. Theodore's arrest was only part of the plan. The real danger had always been what would happen to Cassandra once Theodore realized he'd been outmaneuvered. 6 miles away, Cassandra was discovering exactly what that danger looked like. She'd been in her room, supposedly preparing for bed, while actually listening for any news about the success or failure of Marcus's plan, when Eleanor had knocked on her door with unusual urgency. "Cassandra, dear, you need to come downstairs." "Immediately," her mother had said, her voice carrying a strain that suggested something was very wrong. "Your father needs to speak with you." Cassandra had found William in the study, his face ashen and his hands shaking as he held a telephone receiver. When he saw her, his expression shifted from shock to something that looked almost like fear. "It's over," he said simply. "Theodore's been arrested. The FBI has recordings, witnesses, evidence of everything. Our arrangement with the Blackwoods is finished." The words should have filled Cassandra with relief, but something in her father's tone warned her that the nightmare wasn't ending. It was just changing shape. "What does that mean for us?" she asked carefully. "It means," came a new voice from the doorway, "that plans have changed significantly." Cassandra turned to see Sheriff Daniel Hawkins entering the study, but something was wrong with the picture. The sheriff's badge was gone, his uniform looked disheveled, and there was a wild desperation in his eyes that made her stomach clench with dread. "Sheriff Hawkins," William said nervously. "I wasn't expecting—" "Sheriff Hawkins is finished," the man interrupted harshly. "When Theodore goes down, he's taking everyone who helped him with him. That includes me, your precious bank president husband, and anyone else who benefited from the Blackwood arrangement." Cassandra realized with growing horror that they were looking at a man who had nothing left to lose. Sheriff Hawkins had built his career on corruption and intimidation, and with Theodore's arrest, that career was over. But more than that, he was facing federal prison for his role in the conspiracy, and desperate men were capable of anything. Theodore had one final instruction before his arrest, Hawkins continued, his hand resting on the weapon at his side. If everything went wrong, if the plan failed, there was still one way to make sure the soldier paid for his interference. "What are you talking about?" Cassandra asked, though she was beginning to understand with dawning terror. "The soldier cares about you more than his own life," Hawkins explained with the logic of madness. "Theodore figured that out early on. So if we can't destroy him directly, we destroy what he loves most. We make him watch as the woman he fought so hard to save dies anyway." The casual way Hawkins discussed murder made Cassandra's blood run cold. But what terrified her even more was the realization that this wasn't just desperate revenge, it was a carefully planned contingency that Theodore had put in place precisely for this scenario. "You're talking about killing my daughter," William said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm talking about sending a message," Hawkins corrected. "To the soldier, to the federal agents, to anyone else who thinks they can destroy powerful people without consequences. Some prices are too high to pay, and some lessons need to be taught in blood." Eleanor, who had been standing frozen in the doorway, suddenly found her voice. "You can't just murder people. This is insane." "What's insane?" Hawkins replied, turning toward her with eyes that held no sanity at all, "is thinking that any of us had a choice in this matter. Theodore made the arrangements, your husband profited from them, and I enforced them. Now we all pay the price together." The speed with which the situation deteriorated caught everyone off guard. One moment they were standing in the comfortable study discussing an abstract problem, and the next moment Hawkins had drawn his weapon and was herding them toward the door with the efficiency of someone who had planned this scenario in advance. "Where are we going?" Cassandra asked, though she suspected she already knew. "Someplace dramatic," Hawkins replied with grim satisfaction. Theodore was very specific about the symbolism he wanted. Something that would haunt the soldier for the rest of his life, assuming he lives long enough to be haunted by anything. The railway crossing at Miller's Bridge had been chosen for maximum psychological impact. It was the same location where Marcus's unit had been ambushed during training exercises, where he'd first learned the lesson about sacrifice and brotherhood that had defined his military service. Theodore, in his methodical cruelty, had researched Marcus's background thoroughly enough to find the one place that would amplify the trauma of watching Cassandra die. The old trestle bridge carried the main freight line across Miller's Creek, 50 feet above the water and directly in the path of the regular freight runs that supplied the county's industrial operations. It was isolated enough for Hawkins to work without interruption, but visible enough from the access road that Marcus would have a clear view of what was happening when he arrived. Because Hawkins was counting on Marcus arriving, the corrupt sheriff had sent word through channels he knew would reach the veteran network, informing them that Cassandra Mitchell would be executed at midnight unless Marcus Sullivan surrendered himself to face justice for his crimes against the Blackwood family. "It's a trap, obviously," Hawkins had explained to his captives as he forced them out of their cars at the railway crossing. "But it's a trap that your soldier friend won't be able to resist. He'll come charging to the rescue like the hero he thinks he is, and then we'll finish what Theodore started." The ropes that bound Cassandra to the railway ties were the same ones that had been used in the earlier deception, but this time there was no substitute victim and no federal agents waiting in the shadows. This time the train that approached through the darkness carried real death, and the only person who might save her was racing through the night with no backup and no plan except desperate love. Marcus had received the message while still at the federal command post, helping Agent Rodriguez organize the evidence that would dismantle the Blackwood corruption network. The words hit him like physical blows. "Cassandra Mitchell will die at Miller's Bridge unless Marcus Sullivan surrenders himself by midnight. Come alone or watch her burn." The reference to fire wasn't metaphorical. Hawkins had positioned barrels of gasoline at strategic points around the bridge, creating an inferno that would be triggered by the approaching train's heat and sparks. Whether Cassandra died from the locomotive or the flames would depend on timing, but either way, her death would be agonizing and spectacular. "You can't go," Agent Rodriguez had said immediately. "It's obviously a trap designed to kill you both." "Then stop me," Marcus had replied, already moving toward the door. But stopping Marcus Sullivan, when he was fighting for someone he loved, was like trying to stop a hurricane with good intentions. He'd borrowed a motorcycle from one of the other veterans, ignoring the protests of federal agents who insisted they needed time to organize a proper rescue operation, and disappeared into the night with sirens wailing behind him. The ride to Miller's Bridge took 17 minutes that felt like 17 hours. Marcus pushed the motorcycle beyond its safe limits, taking curves at speeds that should have killed him and running red lights with the desperation of someone for whom traffic laws had become irrelevant. Behind him, he could see the flashing lights of federal vehicles trying to catch up, but he couldn't wait for backup that might arrive too late. The first thing he saw, when he reached the bridge approach, was the glow of flames in the darkness ahead. Hawkins had already ignited the gasoline, creating a wall of fire that separated the railway trestle from the access road. Through the flames, Marcus could see Cassandra tied to the tracks, and beyond her, the silhouette of Sheriff Hawkins standing guard with his weapon drawn. The second thing he noticed was the vibration in the ground. Beneath his feet, the distant but approaching rumble of the midnight freight train that would complete Hawkins's revenge if Marcus couldn't reach Cassandra in time. "Sullivan," Hawkins called out across the flames, his voice carrying clearly in the night air. "Right on time. Though I'm afraid you're going to be disappointed with how this story ends." Marcus assessed the situation with the tactical mind of someone who'd spent years solving impossible problems under extreme pressure. The wall of fire blocked the direct approach to the bridge, but there were other ways to reach the railway trestle, ways that would require him to risk everything, on moves that offered only the smallest chance of success. The creek that ran beneath the bridge was shallow but fast-moving, fed by recent rains that had turned it into a torrent of cold water and sharp rocks. Under normal circumstances, attempting to climb the bridge supports while fighting the current would be suicidal. But these weren't normal circumstances, and Marcus had long ago learned that sometimes the most dangerous option was the only viable one. He abandoned the motorcycle and plunged into the creek without hesitation, the shock of cold water giving way immediately to the more urgent shock of the current trying to sweep him downstream. The bridge supports were slick with moss and spray, offering handholds that were precarious at best. But Marcus had climbed worse surfaces under worse conditions during his military service. Above him, he could hear Hawkins shouting something about cowardice and surrender, but the words were lost in the roar of water and the growing rumble of the approaching train. Every second counted now. Every movement had to be perfect, because there would be no second chances if he fell or hesitated or miscalculated the distances involved. The climb up the bridge support took less than 2 minutes, but required every ounce of strength and determination Marcus possessed. When he finally hauled himself onto the railway trestle, gasping and dripping creek water, he found himself face to face with Sheriff Hawkins across the length of the bridge. "Impressive," Hawkins said, raising his weapon, "but ultimately pointless. You're too late to save her, and now you get to die watching her burn." But Marcus hadn't climbed the bridge to engage in conversation with a madman. He'd climbed it to save the woman he loved, and every second of delay meant the train was closer to completing Hawkins's revenge. Without warning, he launched himself across the gap between them with the explosive speed of someone who'd spent years training for exactly this kind of desperate combat. The fight that followed was brief but vicious, taking place on a narrow railway trestle with 50-foot drops on either side, and the sound of an approaching locomotive growing louder with each passing second. Hawkins had the advantage of a weapon, but Marcus had the advantage of desperation and superior training. plus the psychological edge that came from fighting for something more important than his own life. When Hawkins went over the side of the bridge, his scream was lost in the roar of Miller's Creek and the approaching train. Marcus didn't watch him fall. He was already moving toward Cassandra, his fingers working frantically at the ropes that bound her to the railway ties while his mind calculated how much time they had before the locomotive reached them. "Marcus?" Cassandra's voice was weak but conscious, and the sound of it gave him strength he didn't know he still possessed. "I'm here," he said, his hands never stopping their work on the ropes. "I'm going to get you out of this." The freight train's headlight was visible now, cutting through the darkness and the smoke from the fires that still burned around the bridge. Approaches. The locomotive was perhaps a mile away, traveling at full speed and carrying enough momentum to pulverize anything that remained on the tracks. The last rope came free just as the train's horn sounded its warning blast, echoing across the valley. With the finality of Judgment Day, Marcus hauled Cassandra to her feet, his arms supporting her weight as feeling returned to her cramped limbs. "Can you move?" he asked urgently. "I think so," she replied, though her legs were unsteady from being bound for so long. The freight train was half a mile away now, its headlight illuminating the entire bridge and its horn sounding continuously as the engineer spotted the fires and realized something was wrong. But Marcus knew the engineer couldn't stop the train in time. The laws of physics were more powerful than human intention, and a fully loaded freight locomotive needed more than half a mile to come to a complete stop. The only escape was the bridge support that Marcus had climbed to reach the trestle, but getting Cassandra down safely would require time they didn't have and strength that was already depleted from his fight with Hawkins. "Hold on to me," Marcus said, wrapping his arms around Cassandra and moving toward the edge of the bridge. "Whatever happens, don't let go." "Marcus, we can't," Cassandra began, but her words were cut off by the deafening roar of the approaching locomotive. The train was only a few hundred yards away now, its mass and speed creating a wind that tugged at their clothing and a sound that drowned out everything else in the universe. Marcus looked down at the dark water of Miller's Creek, calculating angles and distances with the precision of someone who'd made similar life or death decisions under fire. "Trust me," he said, and then he jumped. The fall seemed to last forever. A moment of weightlessness and terror suspended between the bridge and the water below. Marcus twisted in midair, positioning himself to take the impact and protect Cassandra from the worst of the collision with the creek. When they hit the water, the shock was tremendous, cold in force, and the immediate disorientation of being tumbled by a current that cared nothing for human plans or love or heroism. But they were alive, and they were together and above them. The freight train thundered across the bridge that had nearly become their grave, its horn still wailing into the night as if mourning what might have been. Marcus struggled to the surface with Cassandra in his arms, fighting the current and his own exhaustion to reach the muddy bank where federal agents were already wading in to help them. As hands pulled them from the water and voices asked urgent questions about injuries and needs, Marcus looked into Cassandra's eyes and saw his own impossible joy reflected there. They had survived. They were free. And for the first time since this nightmare began, the future stretched ahead of them like an open road rather than a closing trap dot above them on the bridge. The last car of the freight train disappeared into the darkness, carrying with it the echoes of a story that would be told and retold among the veterans of Millbrook County, the story of a warrior who had ridden through fire to save the woman he loved, and of love that had proven stronger than power, corruption, or the forces that sought to destroy it. The federal courthouse in the state capitol buzzed with activity as the most significant corruption trial in the region's history reached its conclusion. 6 months after that night at Miller's Bridge, Theodore Blackwood sat in an orange jumpsuit behind the defendant's table, his empire reduced to ashes and his future measured in decades rather than years. The evidence against him was overwhelming. David Chun's recordings, Agent Rodriguez's testimony, financial records seized from Blackwood Industries, and witness statements from dozens of intimidated workers and officials painted a picture of systematic corruption that had infected every level of local government. Theodore's attempted murder of Marcus and Cassandra had become the capstone charge that guaranteed he would never see freedom again. Cassandra sat in the gallery beside Marcus, watching as the judge delivered sentences that would dismantle the network of power that had controlled her life for 23 years. Theodore received 45 years for conspiracy, kidnapping, attempted murder, and racketeering. William Mitchell got 15 years for his role in the financial crimes and corruption scheme. Sheriff Hawkins, whose body had been recovered from Miller's Creek 3 days after the bridge incident, was beyond earthly justice, but his crimes were documented for history. How do you feel? Marcus asked quietly as they watched Theodore being led away in chains. Free, Cassandra replied, and the word carried a weight of meaning that encompassed everything they'd fought for and sacrificed to achieve. The months since their escape from the railway bridge had been a whirlwind of federal investigations, media attention, and legal proceedings, but they'd also been the happiest of Cassandra's life. For the first time ever, she was making her own choices, building her own future, and discovering who she truly was when freed from other people's expectations. She'd moved out of her family's house the day after the bridge incident, despite Eleanor's tearful protests about reputation and social standing. The modest apartment she'd rented across town was smaller than her childhood bedroom, but it felt like a palace because it was hers. She'd taken a job at the Veterans Hospital, not as a volunteer now, but as a full-time counselor helping returned soldiers navigate the challenges of civilian life. Marcus had proposed 3 months later, not with an expensive ring and elaborate ceremony, but with a simple question asked while they were working together in the hospital garden. "Will you marry me?" he'd said, his hands dirty from planting tomatoes and his heart in his eyes. Her answer had been immediate and certain, yes. The wedding had taken place 2 weeks ago, in the same hospital chapel where they'd first planned their escape from Theodore's trap. It was nothing like the elaborate society event that had been planned for her marriage to Theodore. Instead of 300 guests, there were 30 veterans and their families, hospital staff, and the few friends who had supported them through their ordeal. Instead of an expensive gown, Cassandra wore a simple white dress that she'd chosen herself. Instead of a reception at the country club, they'd celebrated with barbecue in the hospital's community room, where James Rodriguez had given a toast that made everyone cry. "To Marcus and Cassandra," he'd said, raising his beer bottle, in salute, "who prove that love is the only power that can't be bought, sold, or corrupted. May your marriage be everything that freedom was meant to protect." Now, watching the final chapter of their legal ordeal conclude in the federal courthouse, Cassandra felt the last shadows of her old life lifting away. The nightmare was over. The people who had tried to own her were gone. The future stretched ahead of them like an open highway, full of possibilities they would choose together. "What now?" Marcus asked as they walked out of the courthouse into the bright afternoon sunshine. "Now we go home," Cassandra said, taking his hand and marveling again at how perfectly it fit with hers. Home was a small house they'd bought on the outskirts of town, with a workshop where Marcus could continue working on motorcycles and cars, and a garden where Cassandra was learning to grow the vegetables and herbs that would feed their family. It wasn't grand or impressive, but it was theirs, built on love rather than obligation, chosen rather than inherited. The drive back to Millbrook took them past the railway crossing at Miller's Bridge, where wildflowers now grew through the charred remains of Sheriff Hawkins's fire. They'd talked about avoiding the place, about taking alternate routes that didn't carry memories of terror and violence. But in the end, they decided that the bridge was part of their story, the place where they'd chosen each other over safety, where love had proven stronger than the forces arrayed against it. "Do you ever regret it?" Marcus asked as they passed the bridge. Giving up the life you were supposed to have? Never, Cassandra replied without hesitation. I regret the pain it caused my mother, and I regret that my father chose corruption over family, but I don't regret choosing love over security. I don't regret choosing you. The house welcomed them back with the warmth of a place that had been shaped by genuine affection rather than social expectations. Marcus went to his workshop to finish rebuilding the engine of a vintage motorcycle that belonged to one of the veterans, while Cassandra checked on the garden where their tomatoes were beginning to ripen in the summer heat. As evening fell, they sat on their small front porch, watching the sun set over the fields that stretched beyond their property line. It was a simple pleasure, the kind that wealthy people often missed because they were too busy acquiring more wealth to notice the beauty that surrounded them. James called today, Marcus said, settling beside her on the porch swing they'd built together. The support group wants to start a program for families of veterans, helping spouses and children understand what their loved ones have been through. That sounds important, Cassandra replied. Do they need help organizing it? They need someone who understands both trauma and healing, someone who's been through her own battles and knows what recovery looks like. Marcus smiled at her. I told them I knew exactly the right person. The work would be challenging, helping families navigate the complex dynamics of reintegration and healing. But it was also exactly the kind of meaningful contribution Cassandra had always dreamed of making. Using her own experiences of breaking free from control and manipulation to help others find their path to freedom felt like the perfect continuation of their story. I'd like that, she said, leaning against Marcus's shoulder and feeling the solid strength that had carried them both through their darkest moments. As stars appeared in the darkening sky, they talked about their plans for the future, the children they hoped to have, the garden they wanted to expand, the ways they could contribute to their community without seeking power or control over others. They were simple dreams, the kind that didn't require vast wealth or social position, but they felt more valuable than anything Theodore's money could have bought. Thank you, Cassandra said suddenly. For what? Marcus asked. For showing me what real strength looks like. For teaching me that love doesn't require sacrifice of self, but sacrifice for each other. For proving that heroes aren't born into privilege. They're made by the choices they make when everything is on the line. Marcus was quiet for a moment, processing her words. You saved yourself, Cassandra. I just provided backup. We saved each other, she corrected. That's what partners do. In the distance, they could hear the sound of a freight train crossing the county on its nightly run, its horn echoing across the fields and forests that surrounded their new life. But instead of bringing memories of terror and near death, the sound now represented something else entirely, the rhythm of life continuing, of journeys being completed, of destinations being reached after long and difficult travels. The train's whistle faded into the night, leaving behind the peaceful sounds of summer crickets in the grass, wind in the trees, and the quiet contentment of two people who had fought for the right to choose their own destiny and won. They sat together on their porch until late into the night, talking and dreaming and planning the future they would build together. When they finally went inside, it was to a home they had chosen, a bed they had bought with money honestly earned, and a life that belonged entirely to them. The banker's daughter and the warrior had become simply Cassandra and Marcus Sullivan, partners in the greatest adventure of all, the adventure of building a life based on love, respect, and the freedom to choose each other every single day. In the darkness beyond their windows, the railway tracks stretched into the distance, carrying trains to distant destinations and new possibilities. But for Cassandra and Marcus, the journey was complete. They had found what they were looking for, not in some far-off place, but in each other, in the choices they had made, and in the courage they had found to fight for something more valuable than wealth or power. They had fought for love, and love had won. The story that had begun with a woman tied to railway Tracks by the forces of greed and control had ended with two people free to write their own future, to choose their own adventures, and to face whatever challenges lay ahead together. As Marcus had once told her, real strength came from connection, from having someone's back and knowing they had yours. In the quiet sanctuary of their chosen life, surrounded by the simple treasures they had built together, Cassandra and Marcus Sullivan had found the kind of strength that no amount of money could buy and no degree of corruption could destroy. They had found each other, and in doing so, they had found themselves. The warrior had ridden through fire to save her, but in the end, they had saved each other. 5 years after the night at Miller's Bridge, the annual Veterans Memorial Barbecue had become the largest community gathering in Millbrook County. What had started as a small appreciation dinner for returned soldiers had grown into a celebration that brought together hundreds of families, creating connections across the social divisions that had once seemed permanent. Cassandra Sullivan stood at the edge of the crowd, watching her husband Marcus flip burgers on one of the massive grills they'd set up in Riverside Park. Their 3-year-old daughter, Sarah, was perched on his shoulders, her small hands tangled in his hair as she pointed excitedly at the children playing nearby. The scene filled Cassandra with a contentment so profound it still sometimes surprised her. Hard to believe it all started with a few guys meeting in the hospital break room, said James Rodriguez, joining her at the picnic table where she'd been organizing registration forms for the new family support program. The best things usually start small, Cassandra replied, smiling as she watched Sarah convince Marcus to carry her toward the playground. One person deciding to help another, one choice to do what's right instead of what's easy. The transformation of Millbrook had been gradual but undeniable. With the Blackwood corruption network dismantled, new businesses had moved into the county, bringing jobs that didn't depend on intimidation or exploitation. The Veterans Hospital had received federal funding for expansion, becoming a model facility that drew wounded soldiers from across the region. Most importantly, the culture of fear that had dominated local politics for decades had been replaced by something healthier, a community where people felt empowered to speak up, to help each other, and to hold their leaders accountable. Eleanor Mitchell had been the most surprising beneficiary of these changes. Freed from the constant pressure to maintain appearances and navigate corrupt social hierarchies, she discovered a talent for organizing charitable events and a genuine passion for helping elderly residents of the county. She'd moved into a modest apartment downtown and had become one of the most respected volunteers at the senior center. She's happier now than I ever saw her during the marriage, Eleanor confided to Cassandra during one of their weekly coffee meetings. I didn't realize how exhausting it was to pretend all the time, to worry constantly about what other people thought of our family. The relationship between mother and daughter had required careful rebuilding, but it was now stronger than it had ever been during Cassandra's childhood. Eleanor had apologized sincerely for her role in trying to force the marriage to Theodore, acknowledging that she'd been so focused on Social Security that she'd forgotten about her daughter's happiness. I was terrified of losing our position, Eleanor had explained. I thought that without the Blackwood connection, we'd have nothing. But it turns out we had the most important thing all along. We had each other. William Mitchell had received a different kind of transformation. Federal prison had been a harsh teacher, but he'd used his time to reflect on the choices that had led him there. His letters to Cassandra had evolved from angry justifications to genuine expressions of remorse, and eventually to proud updates about the literacy program he'd started for fellow inmates. I won't ask you to forgive me, he'd written in his most recent letter. I made choices that hurt you and put you in danger, and I have to live with that. But I want you to know that watching you build the life you chose has been the proudest moments I've had in years. You became the person I should have taught you to be, despite my failures rather than because of my guidance. The family support program that Cassandra now directed had helped over 200 families navigate the challenges of reintegration and healing. Her own experience of breaking free from control and manipulation had given her unique insights into the dynamics of trauma and recovery, making her one of the most effective counselors in the state. "You have a gift for helping people see their own strength," Dr. Patricia Wells, the hospital's chief psychologist, had told her during her most recent performance review. "You don't try to fix them or tell them what they should do. You help them remember who they are underneath all the damage." Marcus had found his own calling in a different direction. His work with individual veterans had evolved into advocacy at the state level, testifying before legislative committees about the needs of returning soldiers and helping to draft policies that would prevent other communities from developing the kind of corrupt systems that had nearly destroyed their lives. "The thing about corruption," he'd explained to a congressional subcommittee the previous year, "is that it always targets the most vulnerable first. Veterans, immigrants, working families, anyone who doesn't have the resources to fight back effectively. If you want to protect democracy, you have to protect the people who sacrifice to defend it." His testimony had contributed to the passage of the Veterans Protection Act, which created federal oversight mechanisms for local programs serving former military personnel. It wasn't perfect legislation, but it was a start, and Marcus had learned that meaningful change usually happened one small victory at a time. Their own family had grown not just with Sarah's arrival, but with the addition of Tommy Martinez, the young veteran Marcus had counseled during Cassandra's first volunteer days. At the hospital, Tommy had struggled with substance abuse and homelessness in the years following his discharge, but the support network Marcus had helped build around him had eventually provided the stability he needed to heal. "You saved my life," Tommy had told them when he'd asked if he could rent the small apartment they'd built above Marcus's workshop. "Not just once, but over and over, every time I wanted to give up." Tommy now works as a peer counselor at the hospital, using his own experiences with addiction and recovery to help other veterans find their way back to stability. His presence in their daily lives had enriched their family in ways Cassandra could never have anticipated. He was an uncle to Sarah, a brother to Marcus, and proof that the work they were doing made a real difference in individual lives. As the barbecue continued around them, Cassandra reflected on how different this gathering was from the social events of her youth. There were no careful hierarchies here, no calculations about who was worth speaking to based on their wealth or connections. Instead, there were conversations between people who had found common ground in service and sacrifice, in the recognition that everyone had something valuable to contribute. "Mama!" Sarah's voice called out from the playground, where she'd convinced a group of older children to help her build an elaborate castle in the sandbox. "Come see what we made." Cassandra walked over to admire the construction, listening as Sarah explained the architectural details with the seriousness of a 3-year-old who had discovered the joy of collaborative creation. Watching her daughter play with children from all different backgrounds, sons and daughters of veterans, immigrants, working families who had benefited from the economic changes in the county, Cassandra felt hopeful about the world Sarah would inherit. "She's going to grow up thinking this is normal," Marcus said, appearing beside them with grass stains on his shirt from an impromptu football game. "Kids playing together regardless of where their parents came from or how much money they have. Maybe it should be normal," Cassandra replied, taking his hand and feeling the familiar comfort of his calloused palm against hers. As the sun began to set over Riverside Park, the crowd gradually thinned as families headed home with full stomachs and renewed connections. Marcus and Cassandra worked with the other organizers to clean up the tables and pack away the leftover food, which would be distributed to veterans who hadn't been able to attend. "Same time next year?" asked Robert Chun, David's brother, who had become one of the event's primary coordinators. "Wouldn't miss it," Marcus replied, settling Sarah into her car seat as she fought to stay awake despite the day's excitement. The drive home took them past Miller's Bridge, where a small memorial now marked the spot where Sheriff Hawkins had died and where Cassandra and Marcus had nearly lost everything. The memorial wasn't for Hawkins, it was for all the victims of the corruption network. A reminder that freedom required constant vigilance and that ordinary people had the power to stand up to those who would abuse their authority. Tell me the story again, Sarah said sleepily from her car seat, as she did every time they passed the bridge. Once upon a time, Cassandra began, using the simplified version they'd created for their daughter. There was a princess who was trapped by people who wanted to make choices for her instead of letting her choose for herself. And then the night came, Sarah continued, knowing the story by heart. And then the night came, Marcus agreed, glancing at his wife with the same love she'd seen in his eyes that first night in the hospital break room. But the most important part wasn't the rescue. The most important part was that they chose each other, and they chose to help other people make their own choices too. And they lived happily ever after, Sarah finished with satisfaction. They lived freely ever after, Cassandra corrected gently. Which is even better than happily, because it means they got to choose their own happiness every single day. As they pulled into the driveway of their home, expanded now to accommodate their growing family and Tommy's apartment, Cassandra reflected on the truth of that statement. Happiness had been what she'd thought she wanted during those desperate months when she'd felt trapped by other people's expectations. But freedom had turned out to be so much more valuable than happiness, because freedom meant the power to create your own happiness, to choose your own values, and to decide what kind of person you wanted to become. The railway tracks that had once symbolized the trap that was closing around her now carried trains full of possibilities to destinations she and Marcus would choose together. Their love story hadn't ended with a rescue, it had begun with one, and continued every day as they chose each other and chose to use their freedom in service of something larger than themselves. In the quiet of their home, as they tucked Sarah into bed and settled into their own evening routine, Cassandra and Marcus Sullivan lived the truth that had sustained them through their darkest moments. Real love wasn't about possession or control, but about empowerment and choice. It wasn't about finding someone to complete you, but about finding someone who inspired you to become the person you were meant to be. The warrior had ridden through fire to save her, but they had saved each other. And in doing so, they had helped save their entire community. Their love story had become larger than themselves, creating ripples of change that would continue long after their own story ended. And every night, as freight trains crossed the country carrying goods and dreams to distant destinations, their whistle song carried the echo of a truth that Theodore Blackwood and his kind would never understand. Love freely given was the only power that could never be corrupted, and freedom defended was the only victory that lasted forever. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.